The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
So tonight, the topic is Christianity and Wokeism. Okay, so before I go to this topic on Wokeism, let me teach you a literary technique. First, I hope this works. Okay, look at this number sequence here and tell me which number doesn't fit. Can just shout out. Let's have fun tonight, okay? Don't need to be so formal. Which number does not fit in this number? 0 doesn't fit, Okay. Okay. Okay, what is the number sequence? 1 0 1 0. So actually it's the, oh yeah, you're right, it's 0. I was thinking about 1. It's right. It's the 0 doesn't fit, right? It should be a 1 0. Okay? Now, what do we call this? We call this a binary. Binary means it has two parts. And the two parts are usually different. Sometimes they are opposites. If they are opposites, we call it binary opposition. So this literary technique is going to be called binary opposition. Let me give you another exercise. My daughter is 9 years old, so she has to do this for her primary 3 tests and all that. So let's say I give you this pattern. Okay, what are 2 ways that you can organize this pattern? Colors. Okay, and shapes, right? Colors and shapes, okay? Again, I want us to think about this topic of binary, all right? We are thinking about binary. Why did you organize the shapes in this way, right? It's because we think and we see the world in binaries, okay? So the first technique I want us to think about is this technique called binary oppositions. That when we think about reality and the world, right, there are binary opposites. So first step is look for the dominant binary in any text that you read. So for example, this is a text here. The dominant binary would be light and dark. Okay, let's look at another one. This dominant binary is male and female, right? Binaries shape our world. Okay, now second thing I want to bring across is that binaries are not equal. Okay, they are different, but they are not equal. So this is a photo taken in the US 1950s, North Carolina. And you can see there is a binary here, but it's not the same, right? The binary is white and colored. Okay, so let's look at this carefully. And I want us to think about these 2 things now. Binary oppositions together with associations, which means when you look at 2 opposite things, look at what ideas or values are associated with each side of the opposition. Let me give an example. In this photo, the 2 binaries are, what are the 2 binaries? White and colored, right? White and black, okay? Okay. So what are the ideas or values associated with each? So for example, we could say the white. Look at for the whites, the basin is bigger. It is also cleaner. For the blacks, the basin is smaller. It also looks dirtier. So this helps us see that binaries are not equal, right? For the one that is on the left, it looks more modern. The one that is on the right looks little less civilized. So binaries can be biased. Okay, the third step, This technique is called looking at binary oppositions and the concepts associated with each binary. Okay? Now, this is a harder one because it's not an image. And this is a poem everybody knows. Okay? So Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Now, if I ask you, let's look at the binary opposition and associations in this text. What is the dominant binary? The dominant means the most obvious one. Jack and Jill, correct? Okay, now look at the words associated with Jack and the words associated with Jill. Do you see any difference? Okay, so first I would say Jack comes first. How do we know Jack comes first? Because he's mentioned first. And also he fell down first. Okay, so Jack comes down first. Jill is second. Now, even more important is the associations. What word is associated with Jack when he fell down? Is the word crown. The word crown in English means head. So Jack fell down, broke his head. But the word crown also has another connotation, another implied meaning. It means kingship. It means leadership. Whereas the word that is associated with Jill is tumbling. And what is associated with tumbling? Clumsiness, right? Disorganized. Okay, so you can see binaries are not equal. In this text, the Jack figure is more positive. The descriptions are more positive. Okay, so let me summarize this idea. Okay, this technique is called looking at binary oppositions and the associations tied to each side. In summary, first, in any text, look for the dominant binary opposition. Then second step, look for the ideas or values associated with each side of the opposition. And then ask yourself which side is more favored, which side seems more positive than the other. Okay? All right, congratulations everyone. You have just learned one of the main techniques of social justice. This is one of the most common and basic techniques that a lot of social justice scholars often use when they critique culture and text, okay, which is to look for binary oppositions and the associations tied with it. And the purpose is to identify bias and prejudice, because oftentimes this is invisible. This is invisible in the text that we read, okay? All right, so we'll come back to this later on, but I thought we'll start with that icebreaker. So today, I'm going to be talking about wokeism. And what is wokeism? And how do we interpret wokeism? And then the positive and the negative aspects of today's wokeism. And then we'll end with a Christian perspective to wokeism. Okay? All right. So let me just start with interpreting wokeism. I'll set the context with reading this passage from Luke chapter 12. Okay. He said to the crowd, okay, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you say at once, a shower is coming. And so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say there will be scorching heat. And so it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky. But why do you not know how to interpret the present time? Okay, so Jesus is talking to the crowds. And a few things we know from this passage. Most people in the crowds were probably farmers or people working in agriculture, okay? They knew how to interpret the weather. They are better than Google, you know? This was the time before satellites, right? When the storm comes, they know. When the heat comes, they know. And why? Because they've been studying the weather. Because they are farmers, it affects their livelihood, okay? And this is not different from us today, right? We are experts at studying whatever affects us. So if you are in finance, you would probably know the stock market and how to read stock market trends very well. If you are a doctor, you probably know how to read your patient's diagnosis. And if you are a teacher, you know how to read your students' behavior and so on, right? We know how to read the climate that's related to our fields. But Jesus called these people hypocrites. He called the crowd hypocrites, okay? Why? They know how to interpret the climate, but they do not know how to interpret the present time. So hypocrites here actually means counterfeit Christians. insincere Christians. They are followers of Christ, but they are not really committed to really knowing Christ. So what is it to be committed to knowing Christ? It's not just, to read the Bible and so on, but it is also to interpret the present time, okay? And time here refers to kairos. It means the season that we are in, and to interpret it with spiritual discernment. So as Christians, it's very important. We need to know what is the season we are in, the cultural moment of our time. And we need to learn to interpret the season with spiritual discernment. Okay? And so that is the purpose of today. So zeitgeist, the idea of zeitgeist is the idea of the spirit of the moment, the spirit of a time in history. And if I think about what are three important movements of today, I think about these three, okay? The first is the digital revolution, okay? We are past the age of steam, electricity, and computing. We are now in what the World Economic Forum calls the fourth industrial revolution. This is the age of AI. This is the age of robotics, okay? The second major movement, which we are going to focus on tonight, is wokeism, right? Every day in the media, you read about people getting cancelled. You read about, gender, race, and so on, right? Wokeism, civic engagement is also on the rise. The last thing which I'm become quite interested in, and I think Christians should also follow, is this trend called neo-tribalism. Neo-tribalism is where people find affinities with their groups, their small groups. So if I'm a feminist, I find my feminist group. If I'm LGBT, my LGBT group, my race group, and so on. It's based on identity. But what is actually more concerning is that some of these groups have become extremist. Not only have they become extremists, they have entered into mainstream politics. You can just watch the elections in Europe, in France, Germany. The far right has risen, okay? And many of them are preaching ultra-nationalistic, ethnic-centered kind of value system. So we should watch out for all these three things. And maybe they are connected somehow. All right, so let's talk about wokeism, okay? So wokeism basically means being alert and being attentive to social injustices. The term is actually from African American slang language. And it became popular, it became viral from the 2010s because of the Black Lives Matter movement, okay? But as Christians, we shouldn't just reject a term because it is new or, because it's a slang word. We should not just reject it. Actually, this idea of social justice, okay, that is embedded in woke is a very old term, right? It's not a new concept. In fact, we can say that, it has roots in the Christian history. So Luigi Tapparelli reportedly is the first person to use the word social justice. He was an Italian Jesuit priest in the 18th century. And at the time, he told the church, he said, we should go beyond just charity works. The Catholic Church was doing a lot of charity works. But he said, we need to do social justice, which means kind of like activism or civic participation from the ground up, which means bringing people together to serve the community. Okay, so this had this idea of solidarity, bringing communities together to tackle justice and not just depending on church authorities, not just doing passive things like donations. Okay, so this idea of social justice has an older tradition as part of church history. Now, today, of course, woke culture has its own concept. So take a look at some of these words. And do you recognize some of these words? Okay. They will appear here and there again on social media and so on. Okay. And I'll run through a few of these terms. But the woke movement has generally been spearheaded or catalyzed by, race, gender, and climate change. I think these are some of the major movements, okay? So when it comes to race, the Black Lives Matter movement, just a brief history, right, began in 2010s. A lot of awareness in the media because several African-American civilians were killed. Some died, right, due to police brutality, okay? Now, it's not just something happening in the US, right? It's spread all over the world. In Singapore as well, we've become also more race conscious. There have been public discussions about race. There is a Twitter site. No, it's not called Twitter. It's called X or something, or X, right? It's called Brown Lives Matter. So all these discussions have spread around the world. Okay. So what is it that they are advocating? Okay. I think two important ideas, which is we need to respect other people, other cultures. So cultural appropriation is something that they always bring up. For example, it doesn't mean you cannot wear other people's costumes, but it means you must respect the culture that you take something from. Okay, in recent days in Singapore, there have been this backlash against brown face, people who paint their faces brown or black and then they pretend, right? And this is seen as disrespecting another culture. Okay, so other aspects that are a form of disrespect is racial profiling, where you stereotype someone because of the person's race, where you stop someone, right, because he or she is a minority, okay, which is happening also in the US. Now, woke in the Black Lives Matter tradition is also about prejudice that's implicit in our systems and our cultural behaviors. So, for example, white privilege is another term that we hear often. Okay, what it means is that society gives certain benefits because of your color. Okay, so I was just reading a research article from an Australian university that says professors are more likely to read emails from students if their names are Melissa Smith. But if their names are Grace Chen or Omar or Kabul, they are less likely to read those. Okay, so this is called white privilege. Your name, just having a name without seeing you, just your name, you have a Smith or white name, it gives you privileges. Okay, critical race theory is another term that we hear often. It came from academic discourse. It basically means studying racial bias that's implicit in institutional norms and systems. Okay, so this is on race. Let me go now to gender. Another major movement of the wokeism is Me Too movement. Okay, this again started around 2017. Okay, as a result of a lot of high-profile cases that went viral. Okay, involving celebrities and media producers. And once again, it's not just something in the US. It's happening all over Asia, in South Korea, in Taiwan. There were marches and so on. In Singapore also, we know that, there were cases where there was this huge debate about gender harassment, gender equality in our universities. Okay? So from a feminist perspective, what do woke scholars kind of argue for, right? They talk about prejudice, but prejudice not in terms of just systems, but how prejudice can be internalized. Okay, so for example, toxic masculinity. Boys can learn to exhibit toxic masculine behavior that ultimately lead them to dominate and control and have abusive relationships with women. Okay? Gaslighting basically means a woman learns to doubt herself or blame herself, especially in domestic abuse cases. Okay? Now, of course, some of these terms are more positive, like BOPO is another term that's thrown. It means body positivity, which means let us not just follow the trends in the world about what women should look like, Let's celebrate the body in all its different ideals. Finally, another concept that you hear very often is gender performativity. And this term is very important in the feminist and even LGBT community, okay? Gender performativity means gender identity is culturally constructed, and we learn to kind of internalize it through language, through norms, and through repeated acts. Okay, through repetition, we learn how to be a gender. So that's the argument. Okay, so these are some of the common terms. So I just also want to say that, it's not just race, gender, but another kind of activist idea of social justice or movement is the climate movement. And this is spearheaded by a lot of young people all over the world. The Global Climate Rally in Singapore, our youths also led the first youth climate change rally. Okay, so social justice or woke is not just a negative term. It can be used to transform societies. Okay, so we often hear this word sustainability, which is the idea of the long-term coexistence of everyone in the planet, and the idea of intergenerational responsibility, which means we are responsible for young people, all right, the children of the future who will inhabit our planet. Okay? And also conscious capitalism. Because we are responsible, we should also be conscious about what we buy and where we buy things from. Are the companies that we purchase things from, are they ethical? Do they conduct fair trade, fair practices? Okay? All right, so this is just a very quick overview of some of the important movements in woke and the important concepts. Okay? So I want to talk first about the positive things, right? Some obvious things that we've seen already is woke can be positive. Okay? In fact, I think these are very exciting times for young people. When I was in secondary school, all we talked about were boys or studies, right? Nothing else. But now young people, what are they talking about? They're talking about climate change. They're talking about, in the US, gun control. They're talking about social, political issues. It's actually very exciting. The United Nations basically says young people, more than any other time, are more interested in human rights and environmental issues. Okay? A survey by the National Youth Council in Singapore says that 9 out of 10 young people are involved in civic participation. 9 out of 10. So that's very exciting. Okay? I want to talk about some of the positive things that today's woke culture can offer us as Christians. Okay? So, in terms of the actions of social justice, there are many things people can do, okay, from passive to active. The passive ones are things like sharing, dialogue, volunteering, giving. The more active ones are activism, critique, advocacy. But I want to talk about the roots of wokeism. What are the roots of wokeism? Okay? There are many different roots of wokeism, but one of the most influential is critical theory. Is this movement called critical theory? And I want to argue that some of the strategies of critical theory can be useful for the church, okay, when we do social justice. Okay, so what is critical theory? Just a very brief background. Okay, critical theory is a movement that kicked off around the 1930s. Okay, it was a reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, if you recall, was the age of reason, where rationality was king, where all the scientific innovations from Isaac Newton, Galileo, was very prominent and revolutionized the world. Okay? During the Enlightenment, there was this idea that reason can change. Reason can lead to human progress. Reason can cause humanity to just advance and progress. Now, this is what critical theorists disagree with. Their key argument is that the Enlightenment pushed a kind of instrumental reason, which is reason that is used for the advancement of the human race. And many of these Enlightenment thinkers from the Frankfurt School in Germany, these are Horkheimer, Adorno, Habermas, right? They said that if you look at reason, it can be used by those in power to oppress people and, in effect, to destroy the world, as we saw in World War I and II. So I put the picture of the poster of Oppenheimer. Has anyone watched this movie? Okay, go watch this movie. It's very good. Okay. But Oppenheimer in history, he invented the atomic bomb, right? And then at one stage, he did not want to go ahead with the hydrogen bomb because he realized that if science keeps progressing, we're going to end up destroying the whole world. Okay? So this idea that reason alone can lead to progress is something that critical theorists say, look, we need to look at this more closely. Okay? Reason can be tied to power, can be used to dominate people. And therefore, what we need is to critique power in social reality. We need to critique the users of knowledge and reason and how the powerful use that to dominate, especially the effects of capitalism, the effects of technology, the effects of culture. Many of the people from the critical theory school, the Frankfurt School, were influenced by Marxism, by Nietzsche and philosophers like Marx. Okay. Now, a related strand, which we'll come to focus a little bit, is post-structuralism. It's related to critical theory. Okay. These were scholars from the French philosophers like Derrida and Foucault, right? And they were interested in language initially and later culture. Okay. So, a very well-known French linguist called Ferdinand Saussure came up with this theory that we understand the world through language. But what is the structure of language? What is the structure of language? And he made this groundbreaking insight that language is determined by difference. Language is determined by difference. So, for example, what is a dog? A dog is not a cat. What is a cat? A cat is not a giraffe. We can go on and on. But how we understand things is by difference. Okay? Now you can see, if we understand things by difference, that's why we see reality sometimes through binaries. Okay? This becomes a very important strategy in a technique that Derrida introduced called deconstruction, a theory, okay, called deconstruction, which is known as a hermeneutics of suspicion, which means when you interpret things, we should approach text with a skeptical view. We should read it skeptically. How? We should look at how the difference is set up in a text. For example, what we did before, we can look at bias in a text. Where is the binary in the text? Which part of the binary is more favored than the other? We can also look at contradictions in a text. We can look at gaps. We can trace the historical influence in a text. We can look at undecidability, the ambiguities in a text, right? This is all part of the strategy or the technique of this deconstruction, okay? So let's give another example, and let's see whether you remember what you all did just now at the beginning. The binary opposition technique, do you all remember? Okay, let's try to apply this, okay? Now, do you all know ugly duckling story? Yes, okay. So I was reading this storybook when my girl was very young. It's called The Ugly Duckling, and I stopped halfway because it struck me. I just realized something. I applied what I taught you all, okay? The binary opposition thing. So let's see whether we can see it. There once was an ugly duckling with feathers all stubby and brown. And the other birds, in so many words, said, "Get out of town." This is the beginning of the book. Now let's go to the ending of the book. We know the ugly duckling story turns into a swan. And what does it say? The best in town. And I'm not such an ugly duckling. I'm not stubby and brown. Okay? So if you apply what I taught you at the beginning, what is the dominant binary opposition? White and brown, right? First is more basic, okay? The duckling and the swan. First, look at the dominant opposition. Look at the concepts or values associated with it. The duckling is ugly, it's brown, and it's stubby. The swan is beautiful, it's white, and it's slim. And which is favored, obviously, is the swan. So actually, this storybook that we've been telling our kids has an inherent bias. It is racist. It is. Okay? I don't know how many of y'all have gone to botanic gardens, but do you know there's a black swan in botanic gardens? But has anyone read an ugly duckling story where the duckling starts white and then ends up black? There are black swans. Why is there no book that has a black swan at the end where beauty is black? Why are all the books always like this? So there is a very good TED talk by this writer called Chimamanda Adichie, and she's talking about the danger of the single story. Okay, that's the title of the TED talk. And she said, if you tell something, even if it's not true or stereotype, and if you tell it again and again and again, it will become a truth to someone. Imagine a young girl reading Ugly Duckling, okay? Then after that, you introduce Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which I'm going to show you later. Then what's the next one? Rapunzel. And all these books that she's reading, okay? Beauty is always white, right? Even Lord of the Rings. Have you noticed Lord of the Rings? right? The smartest people are the elves. The darkest race is always the dwarf or the orcs. Color plays a role. And if you keep seeing the same thing over and over again in different versions, right, you might internalize a norm, okay? So what critical theorists are doing, offering us a technique to look at binary oppositions and the bias in text, is actually very useful. It makes us more attuned. It makes us more conscious of implicit bias. Okay, let's do one more example, Snow White. Since I talk about Snow White, we all know Snow White, okay? So just a recap, because I can't remember also, but all right. Somehow there is this queen, I think she says, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most beautiful of them all? And obviously it's Snow White, it's never Snow Black or Snow Yellow, okay, it's Snow White. Okay, then next, the hunter wants to kill her, but then Snow White runs to the forest and she meets the 7 dwarfs, okay? Do you all remember that she goes to the 7 dwarfs' house first? And what does she do? Cleans the house. She doesn't sit there and wait for them to serve. She goes to a house to clean the house. Okay, that's important detail. Okay, next. Then after that, the wicked witch comes and gives her a poisoned apple. She falls into a deep sleep. How does the story end? Who rescues her? The prince. Okay? None of the 7 dwarfs can rescue her. Only the prince can rescue her. 7 dwarfs cannot do anything. There are 7 of them. Cannot. Only a white prince. Okay. So, if you are a feminist, you would say there is a gender bias, right? Again, let's do the opposition thing. Princess is good, stepmother evil. But let's look at the values associated with both. The princess is beautiful. She's domesticated, right? She's submissive. She's passive. The stepmother is actually an ambitious person. If she were a male, you would call the stepmother a leader because she takes initiative. She comes up with a plan. She knows what she's doing. But in this story, the ideal woman is domesticated. The ideal woman is not ambitious. So feminists will say this book does not promote women leaders. It promotes women who can clean the house for dwarfs. Okay? All right. Next. If you come from a Marxist or class, if you are interested in class, then you can say there's also another binary happening in this book. Okay. What is this binary? Okay, elites. Snow White and the prince are from the elite class. They are royalty. The dwarfs are the working class. Okay, and look at what's associated with them. Snow White is clean, so is the prince. You know, they're very dignified. But when you look at the 7 dwarfs, there's this one, the nose is always running lah. There's one very messy, there's grumpy, all this. They're all very disorganized. Working class, all disorganized, all irrational. Most of all, they are powerless. 7 of them cannot save anyone. No power at all. Okay? So Marxist people will say, the prince can only marry the princess. The elite can only marry the elite. This retains an elitist class structure in the text. Okay, finally, if you are from post-colonial, you're looking at race. Okay, you can also look at this text from a race perspective. There are the white race, the prince and Snow White. Okay, the dwarfs are slightly darker race. Okay, so what is the difference? It's also between white, rich, and poor, right? Snow White is rich, the dwarfs are poor. The whites are civilized, dominant. The other races are uncivilized. And once again, they lack power. So again, there is a bias, right? Only the white man can marry the white girl. None of the 7 dwarfs can also marry her. She can only marry the... Why did she get up and say, hey, look, I live with the 7 dwarfs for a longer time. I don't want to marry you. And how come you just kiss me without asking my consent? Terrible. No, she didn't do that. She went off to marry the prince. Okay? So from whatever angle you come from, right, you can discern bias in text. All right. So those of you who are parents, so now you all know, okay, Snow White, ugly duckling, okay? And think about other texts you've read. What can we read now? Okay, read local text, support local authors. Okay. All right. So this is a diagram that I came up with. So I teach ethics at NIE. So one of the things we think about is the most difficult, the most powerful kinds of injustice are invisible, right? When we think about visible injustice, you think about, say, war, conflict, racism. These are very obvious. But it's the invisible ones that are powerful and you can't see them. Like systemic, right? They are in the policies, they are in the social structures. They could be linguistic, like we've done a lot of examples in storybooks. There is an implicit bias in the language, in the binary opposition that is set up, right? There could be ostracism, xenophobia. And another big word of the woke movement is intersectionality, right? Which means that it can touch on any of these multiple areas, not just one. A person can be affected by injustice in more ways than one. For example, a minority woman, right? Maybe she will be disadvantaged because she's a woman. Maybe she's disadvantaged also because of her race. So multiple factors can lead to her marginalization. Okay, so this is called the web of injustice. Now, how is this important for us as a church? As I mentioned, critical theory gives us important tools to help us be more discerning. Okay, so let me give a real world example. My husband is here, Wilson. Wilson and I, we were in the US for 4 years when I was doing my PhD. Okay, and we served in this mobile bus soup kitchen called New York City Relief Bus. Okay, and what we did weekends, the bus would stop at this neighborhood in Patterson. There are a lot of drug addicts there. You can see it's an African American neighborhood. One time, the shop across from where the bus stopped, there was someone got shot. Okay, so things like this was happening. What we did weekends, we would distribute food. We'll step outside the bus and distribute soup. Okay, and we'll do home visits. And the picture you see here, we had a block party. We blocked out the whole neighborhood, and all the kids came. Okay, one time I set up a table outside the bus. A group of kids came and I tutored one of the girls. And that's when I realized that all these things are good, but they are not enough. Because if you really want to help the poor, there are a lot of systemic things, right, that just serving soup will not change. For example, when we visited the homes of one of the family, the girl I tutored, and I realized she couldn't even read. She was like 16 years old, and she couldn't read a proper paragraph. When we visited the homes, we realized there's no father in the home. Father's absent, and it's not just her home, it's almost every home. Second thing is, the parents do not want to work because they are on welfare. So everybody doesn't work. Okay? The third thing is the education system is broken. The kids are just being promoted 1 year after the other, even though they cannot read, even though they cannot do math. Okay? And there's internalized poverty, meaning they already think that, nobody's going to help us. My parents are not working and my father's not even here. So what's the point? So they internalize this poverty, right? And it's part of the norm. It becomes part of the culture, right? So I realized that at that point, it was not enough just to distribute soup. There were larger systemic problems, okay? And when we do, social justice as a church, when we outreach to the poor, if we are committed to helping people, it cannot just be donations. It cannot just be volunteer, right? We need to understand the poor, where they are from. Okay, so social justice needs to go beyond the superficial. We also need to look deeply into the systems that the poor are in, the systems that affect them. So this is a book by Stephen Corbett. It says, When Helping Hurts. He says, one of the biggest problems in many poverty alleviation efforts is that their design and implementation exacerbates the poverty of being of the rich, their God complexes, and the poverty of being of the poor, their feelings of inferiority and shame. So we also need to think, our efforts to help the poor actually do they make us feel good? Right? Do they make the poor feel bad? What does it really mean to help the poor in deeper ways, in transformative ways? So these are questions that the critical theorist gives us. Okay, I need to make sure time. Okay, all right. Now let me go to the negative aspects of wokeism now, okay? Negative aspects. And at the recent conference, I used this acronym. The secular woke that we see today is SADD, S-A-D-D. It stands for self-righteous, because we see a lot of self-righteous behavior. People think that they are right all the time, and then they cancel and shame others who they think are wrong. So it's also aggressive, right? We call out others, we cancel them. It's disinformed sometimes because we are very quick to react to what we see, but we may not have the complete truth. It could be half-truths, post-truth. And it's disengaged. We cancel the other person. We don't want to engage with him or her, right? Okay, but so this is what we see, but I want to focus, so this is just another example from the Paris Olympics. But I want to focus more specifically on what I think is more dangerous, okay? And I'll go to this idea of the roots of woke. I talked about critical theory earlier, and there is an associated movement that I think is more dangerous, and this is postmodernism, okay? And later I'll link this to Genesis 3, the quest for power. So very broadly, I know I'm mentioning a lot of these terms, but postmodernism continues to be very, very influential today. It's a movement that came about in the 1980s. It influenced arts, politics, philosophy, architecture, and so on, okay? This is one of the earliest and most influential quotes of postmodernism by Lyotard, okay? And he says, simplifying to the extreme, I define the postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. Incredulity means skepticism. Be skeptical about meta-narratives. And meta-narratives means truth claims. Anyone who claims to make a truth claim, like religion, like progress, like science, we have to be skeptical. Okay? So let me explain the difference. There are overlaps. Okay, and some philosophers deal with both. There are overlaps, but some subtle distinctions. So critical theory that we saw just now, I mentioned that it provides interpretive strategies that are useful in looking at bias. So for example, these are two paintings in the Louvre in Paris, but we only know Mona Lisa, right? We don't know the other one. But actually, do you know that it's also in the Louvre? It's also a portrait. But because it's a man, nobody pays attention. Okay, so Mona Lisa is more famous. So critical theorists will say, okay, maybe there's a bias towards the female, the sensual images. All right, so the critical theory is useful. And it looks at things like bias and binaries, okay, as one strategy. Now, postmodernism, on the other hand, also could look at binaries. For example, these are two famous works of art, Mona Lisa and the Campbell soup, okay? And one is high art, one is what Campbell soup itself as a can is considered low. But postmodern would say, let's just combine them all. Let's do away with binaries. Forget about any binaries. We can combine them all. All right? And actually, this painting sold for 11.7 million. Right? So postmodern art is all about taking away binaries, mixing, collapsing, collage, pastiche, all kinds of art forms. Okay, we see this all over fusion food. For example, there's a ayam buah kelak burger. Okay, orange kaya pisang creme brulee. We combine different cultures. There could be culture A, culture B. Postmodernism will say, let's put them all together. Fusion. We call this fusion. There's fashion. Lady Gaga is an example of a postmodern icon, right? Her clothes. Again, there's no dichotomy between classic and futuristic. We can have hybrid identities. We can combine them all. Forget about binaries, right? We can see this in gender also, right? This is the Calvin Klein fragrance, 1994 versus 2016. 1994 has a more distinct male-female binary. By the time you come to 2016, it is let's combine them all. We can have gender fluidity. We don't need to have one or the other. We don't have to have gender binaries. We can have gender fluidity. It's also in movies, right? In a lot of the famous movies, let's forget about reality and non-reality. Let's bend them all together. We have The Matrix, we have Inception. Let's bend reality, let's combine. And just a side note, one of the most popular motifs today in the Marvel and the Spider-Man films is this idea of the multiverse. Multiverse is the same idea. We don't need to have reality and the future or whatever. We can combine parallel realities together. Okay, we don't need to have time as a binary. But we, as critical readers, we also need to think, what is the value system? What is the philosophy behind some of these things? Okay, again, the hardest to see, right? These are ideologies that we need to critically read. So the idea of the multiverse actually is something that Stephen Hawking spoke about in 2010, right? In the book, The Grand Design. And look what he says. The multiverse concept can explain the fine-tuning of physical law without the need of a benevolent creator. In other words, the multiverse means we do not need God, because the universe can fine-tune itself. The universe can just, what's that word called? Survival, like Darwin's that theory, evolution. Yeah, evolution. Evolve by itself, you don't need God. Okay? So this is a quote I like that I think synthesizes some of the dangerous ideas of postmodernism by Stuart Sim. He says, it is a form of skepticism towards authority, towards wisdom, towards culture, towards politics. At the core, it is anti-foundational. Why is it anti-foundational? As I showed you in the examples, it is about doing away with any kind of binaries, any kind of boundaries. And we need to ask ourselves, is this biblical or not as a church, right? So one important thing is to always go back to the blueprint of creation, Genesis chapter 1. Okay? All right, Genesis 3 first. Let me go to Genesis 3. Postmodernism may be something that happened in 1980s, but it has an older root, and that's in Genesis 3. Okay? The first time a skeptical question is asked is from Satan himself, the serpent. And he said to the woman, did God really say? Did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Now, this is an example of a skeptical question, right? In the Hebrew, the word actually means even or really. Did God really say that? Right? Now, an objective question would be, what did God say? What is the tree like? Right? This is called objective question. But a question like, did God really say this? This is a skeptical question meant to create doubt in the mind of the hearer. Right? So Satan asked the first skeptical question. And what was his intention? God had set up creation order, God and man. He set up this binary. Satan's motive was to tell Eve, you will surely not die if you eat the fruit, okay? God knows when you eat of it, your eyes will be open. You will be like God. You will know good and evil. Satan is doing postmodernism. He's trying to destroy the binary that God had set up between God and man. He's trying to say, man, you can be like God. You don't need all this binary. You don't need this separation. You can be like God. And he did this through a skeptical question. This is a postmodern strategy. Okay? So what does this lead to? It leads to the idolatry of the self. And this we see in Genesis 3, right? You can be like God. You can be your own God, right? So Zygmunt Bauman, who is a postmodern globalization scholar, he wrote this book called Postmodern Ethics. And he says, what is postmodern ethics? It is the personalization of morality. That means every person can decide who you want to be. You can choose your own moral values. You don't need to follow anybody anymore. Okay? And this is made worse by social media, because now we can be producers and prosumers. We can produce our own narratives. We can narrate our identity. We can choose multiple identities. Okay? So the danger we see today is not just wokeism. It's the combination of wokeism and postmodernism. And it comes across through a word like diversity. It sounds like a neutral word, but when you read deeply, what do people mean by diversity? It means forget about the limits. Forget about any binaries. Dismantle all the binaries. Have freedom to choose who you want to be. Okay? Criticize any institution that stands in your way, any authority that interferes, and someone who offers a limited view of diversity is seen as backward, is seen as not progressive, and should be cancelled. There have been many instances of this online. Okay? So I just want to say, when we go back to Genesis 1, when we look at the blueprint of creation, the first thing we note is that God actually established binaries in creation. Just look at the first few verses of Genesis 1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He separated light and darkness. This is the binary of dimensions. Heaven and earth is space. Light and darkness is time. God established dimensional binaries. Then in Genesis 1:26, he says, let us make man in our image, right? Let them have dominion over the earth, right? The fish and the birds and so on. This is authority binaries. There is a binary, God and then man and animal. And this authority binary is not about power or dominion, right? It's about caring. God established this binary so that one will care. It's a hierarchy, right? So God will care for man will care for animals. He told man to take care of the animals, of the garden, right? So this is for order, for caring. Then another binary, this people might cancel me for saying this, but I'm just going to say it, gender binary. Genesis 1:27. God also established a gender binary, male and female. It's very clear. There's no other. There's no, right? And what is it for? What is this gender binary for? If you read the verse previously, it is so that man will not be alone, so that he will have a helper, right? So this is for companionship. It is the word helper is used in other parts, especially in Psalms, right? The idea of assistance, the idea of rescue, reward, aid, right? The idea of aid, to help, right? So it's not about dominion. In fact, the idea of power is something that came after the fall. The idea that man, your desire will be contrary to your husband and he shall rule over you. This idea of power only comes as a consequence of the fall. Okay? The relationship was not one of power at this time. And we note also that a lot of diversity happened within the binary system that God created in the world, right? And you can see also in Genesis, right? The words like, let the earth sprout. Let the water swarm with swarms of living things. Be fruitful and multiply. Look at all these verbs. They all speak of diversity. And the earth flourished because of the binaries of dimension, of authority, and of gender that God created at the beginning. Okay? And what we see is the fall. When these binaries were disrupted by Satan, what is the consequence of the fall? Okay, number one, power is now introduced. Genesis 3:6, he said to Eve, the husband will now rule over you. Your desire will be contrary to your husband. This is talking about now power struggle is going to happen in the home. It's a consequence of the fall. And then the ground will be cursed. That means resources will be limited. It's not like Eden. Things will flourish and the resources are plentiful. Now resources are limited. There's also going to be power struggle over resources. So power is going to be something that from creation until now, we are going to be obsessed over, or the woke crowd is going to be obsessed over. Okay, and it's something that came because of the dismantling of the boundaries that God created. So what are the problems we see in wokeism today? That people become power hungry. At the heart of social justice movement, a lot of the anger, what are they calling for? They're asking for power. They want power back because for years they have not had that power. Okay? But the irony is sometimes the woke groups, when they gain power, they use it to oppress other people. So this is a book called Christianity and Wokeness that the Pastor Roland recommended to me, right? And the writer says, white people in America now feel that they are being cancelled for being white, right? Christians are being called to repent because they are white, reject their white fragility. Christians are told they are complicit, right? So you end up condemning people for their color, even though they've not done, anything, right? You end up excluding, oppressing others. Okay. Second thing, the wokeism we see is also negative, a negative kind of criticism, because it's meant to resist, critique, look at systemic injustice. We are all consumed with finding all these systemic injustices. But what it does is that it limits conversations. It's easy to just, shut down, right? Like in Melbourne, there was a council that actually said, let's ban Christmas. Let's just ban it. No, there's no dialogue. There's no conversation. Okay? And finally, we see neo-tribalism, which is each group chooses who they want to be, who they want to find affinity with. And there is an assumption that my identity is self-determined or culturally determined. I can determine my own identity, or my group can determine my identity. I don't need God, I don't need church, right? But again, if we think about Galatians, right? Our identity is given by God. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, right? Our identity, we live for Christ, and our identity is given by God. Okay? Now, I also want to mention that right-wing woke culture, many of whom are very conservative Christians also has some issues, right, that I'm troubled by. Okay, many of them are against the woke movement. But by actually discarding the woke movement completely, they also do not show enough compassion. And they are not also listening enough, right, to the grievances, the histories of hurt that the minority groups have faced. Okay? So that is another problem. Another trend that we are seeing now is, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are several far-right groups, many of whom are saying they are Christians, and they are espousing Christian values. But they are mixing this, okay? They are mixing this with ethnocentric white culture, right? So, for example, I was reading about the recent elections in Europe, and one of the politicians that gained a lot of power didn't win, but she said she's Christian. She wants a Christian country, but later she also says she wants a white European dominant culture in her country, and they are mixing both, and it's not biblical. Okay. All right, so this is what we need to watch out for. Don't just simply support a politician because he says he's Christian. Look at, is he mixing that with something else that is counter to what the Bible says? Okay, I think I'm running out of time. I actually don't know when I'm supposed to stop. Okay, I went off. All right, I'll just take another 10 minutes. I think I'm done with the last part. Let's round up with, so far, are you okay? All right. Let me end with, what is the Christian kind of woke? Okay? I talked about secular woke, sometimes being sad, right? Self-righteous, aggressive, disinformed, disengaged. And I think I want to use another acronym for the Christian woke. I use the acronym of CARE, right? CARE. C stands for Christ-like. A, attuned. R, redemptive. And E, engaged. And let me just run through what each of this can look like, okay? And then we can have a further discussion on what it means in practice. Okay, so Christ-like. I like this diagram by Richard Niebuhr, all right? It's a very old, like 1951, but I thought it's quite useful for us, right? He talks about two extremes, Christ of culture, all right, and Christ against culture. But the middle one is Christ above culture. When we think about Jesus, Jesus was not against culture, neither did he conform to culture. He was in culture, but he was above culture. And there are three different approaches to being above culture, right? One is the synthesis approach, where you see, there are good parts of culture that we can take, like, for example, critical theory. We can apply some of this in our work with the poor, for example, right? Okay, so this is like Aquinas, right? Paradox means there are things that are different between us, right? But we think about how to reconcile these differences, and that's Luther. Transformer of culture is more hopeful. Let's see how we can work to transform culture, right? To change culture into a more impactful way. This is Augustine, okay? So I think it's about having the wisdom to know, right, which approach to use. But I want to give one example, of Jesus. And this story, one of my favorites, the parable of the Samaritan woman. Jesus went out of his way to meet a Samaritan woman, and he asked the woman for water, right? And then afterwards, the woman, they have a conversation. And then John 4:16 says, go and call your husband. And then the woman says, I have no husband. And Jesus says, you are right in saying you have no husband. In fact, you have 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. Now imagine it's not Jesus. It's a woke person. What would a woke person say? Now, Jesus didn't scold her. If I'm right wing, Jesus didn't say, you're not conservative. You're adulterous. You're not supporting family values. He didn't talk to her about that, right? Imagine if Jesus was left wing. He didn't also say, let's analyze the social political discrimination between Jews and Samaritans. Why is it Jews and Samaritans cannot talk? He didn't also launch into that kind of political speech, right? What did Jesus do? Okay? And maybe this is a pedagogical lesson for us to think about. And I love this example. It's so interesting. The story starts with Jesus saying, give me a drink. But later, John 15, a few verses down, is the woman who's asking him for a drink. Give me this water so that I will not thirst. The first thing Jesus does, he gives grace. He sees her need. What is it that she needs? Not literal water. She needs spiritual water. And he makes her thirsty for that living water, such that she is the one who asks him for water. Okay? But Jesus also models grace and truth. He also speaks factually about the fact that she has 5 husbands, and the one she's living with is not her husband. So he shows here grace and truth. And what happens? Jesus then points in the rest of the sermon to himself. The rest of that meeting with the Samaritan woman, he talks about himself, the Messiah, the worshippers, worshiping in spirit and in truth. He points her to himself, and by the end of this story, she becomes an evangelist. She goes back to her village to tell everyone about Jesus. Come see the man who told me all that I ever did. She did not feel condemned. She could have felt condemned. She felt liberated. She felt inspired listening to Jesus. Okay, so Jesus pointed her, okay, not to sin, but made her Christ conscious. Okay, so C is being Christ conscious, care, C-A-R-E. C is Christ conscious. A, we also need to be attuned. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of things. The most complex things are invisible to the eye. So in the iceberg diagram, often we look at language, norms, and rules, but we also need to look, when we are looking at culture, what are the belief systems? What are the underlying worldviews? In any movie or storybook that you watch, that simple strategy I mentioned, what are the binaries? What's the bias in that binary? Okay? What are the historical influences? Okay? Attune not just to injustices in text, but attuned also to social injustices. The injustices that are systemic. So the most famous quote on justice, Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God. And our love for others must be demonstrated in a commitment to really understanding people where they are from, including the culture and the systems that they inhabit. Okay? Right? So I just also want to say that even though, I was giving an example from Jesus and the Samaritan woman, I want to say also when we look at the Old Testament, God is also interested in systems. All right, God is interested in systems, and we can see throughout the Old Testament there are a lot of the laws on on how to meet the rights of the foreigners, the refugees, and the minorities, right? So class distinctions, all are seen as equal. Concern for the poor, right? Like the 7th year, leave the crops unplowed, right? The laws about sharing, foreigners not oppressing foreigners, it occurs 36 times. Slaves, right? That was temporary. Laws about abusing a slave would result in death for the owner. Widows and orphans, right? There are more laws, right? According to Evans, right? More laws in the Old Testament about protecting the rights of the minorities than any A&E, ancient Near East laws at the time, right? So God is also concerned about social policies, and the policies are just and fair, okay? So Christ-likeness, attunement, R is for redemptive. We must be redemptive in our aims. So social justice from the Christian perspective is not about canceling people, but it's to redeem people for Christ. And this is a book I recommend. It's called Biblical Critical Theory. And Christopher Walken says we need to think about out-narrating. It's not about telling the better story in the sense of the most gripping or satisfying. It's about telling the bigger story. We all have the bigger story, the gospel, all right? And that gospel is what redeems and reconciles man to God, okay? The bigger story is that the gospel goes also beyond many of the cultural binaries. I talked about binaries that God established in creation, but there are also cultural binaries that Jesus and Paul and many of the disciples actually, dismantled also, right? Take, for example, the binary between Jew and Gentile. What did the gospel do? It promoted inclusivity. All are saved, right? Every nation who accepts him. The binary between poor and rich, we can see in Acts, right? This is the ideal model of the church, right? There's no rich and poor. All had everything in common. They shared, right? And they gave to the needy. That's that ideal vision of what the church can be. And the biggest story of all is Christ, isn't it, right? We talked a lot about binaries, but I want to end today that says God is above all these binaries. The binaries is the world that we inhabit because we are limited beings. But the God of creation is the one who is above all these binaries. And his love is so multidimensional, so complex. It is not limited by binaries. This is a picture from Watkins' book. He talks about God's justice marries these 4 dimensions: love, mercy, truth, and justice. And no human being, no woke movement can ever combine these 4. And it is combined in the person of Christ. Okay, and that is the power of the gospel, and that is the message of hope in this divided world, in this very angry world, in this world consumed by power. The church needs to think about how to speak a justice that connects love, mercy, truth. Okay, and let me end just with this diagram again. So let us be the Christian kind of woke, a woke of care, Christ-likeness, attuned, redemptive, and engaged. And with that, I end my talk. Thank you very much. I think I'm